Many of us grew up reading and being told the classic old fairy tales. We learned the stories of Cinderella and Sleeping Beauty, as well as Hansel and Gretel. For decades, these stories have been retold and reimagined. Now, one popular series aims at discussing the role these stories play in our culture writ large. The series is called The School for Good and Evil, and the fifth installment in the series was released last week. The books are written by Soman Chainani, a young Harvard graduate who started the first book in the series while working as a private tutor to make some extra money to help pay off his college debt.
I had grown up obsessed with Disney movies. I mean, that's what I watched exclusively growing up because we didn't have cable or internet or video games, and our TV only really played two stations. And so I fell in love with Disney cartoons and that whole fairy tale world. And so when I went to Harvard, that's when I had heard of Maria Tatar, who was this empress of fairy tale academia.
Maria Tatar is the John L. Loeb Professor of Germanic Languages and Literatures and of Folklore and Mythology in the Arts and Sciences Department at Harvard University. She's also the author of several scholarly books about the cultural complexities and psychological impact of fairy tales.
I worked really hard to get into this seminar with her. She only took 10 kids. I didn't know why I wanted to take it so badly. I just knew that there was something about fairy tales and this class that was going to be important for me. And when I was in that class, I sort of discovered just the fact that all those Disney stories were based on this false premise because they'd all come from the Grimm stories and then been sanitized. And so you ultimately took a story like The Little Mermaid, which is really a cautionary tale in the Hans Christian Andersen original version. Ariel is not the hero of that story. She's very much a fallen character. And Disney just changed the ending. So all the poor mistakes she makes that lead to her death in the original story ultimately win her a prince in the Disney movie. And so you're ultimately teaching kids the wrong lesson, and you're actually teaching them the opposite of what the tales were meant to reveal.
For example, according to Tatar's book, The Annotated Classic Fairy Tales, The Little Mermaid, which was originally titled The Little Sea Maid by Hans Christian Andersen, doesn't succeed in capturing the prince's love. She fails utterly, and what's more, gives up all chances of ever seeing her sea family again. Instead, the little sea maid suffers the consequences of her youthful folly and becomes sea foam.
And so that sort of stuck in my head again and again as we read all these original stories. And I realized American kids specifically often grow up with these sort of warped Disney versions of what life is supposed to be like when that's not what was intended at all. But I was more annoyed that a corporation would sell this kind of myth of the happily ever after without really responsibility to the original stories. Because the original fairy tales were meant to be kind of a survival guide to life. It was to teach kids how to be smart. And so to sort of neuter that whole lesson in order to convince girls to believe in this princess fantasy, I actually thought was quite toxic.
So Chainani set out to correct the Disney perception of princesses by creating the School for Good and Evil.
It's about a town where every 4 years 2 kids get kidnapped. The best behaved kid in town gets kidnapped to the School for Good to become a fairy tale hero. The worst behaved kid in town gets kidnapped to the School for Evil to become a fairy tale villain. And this is where all the famous fairy tale characters went once upon a time. So it's been there for thousands of years. Captain Hook went there, Cinderella went there. But we're starting with a whole new fresh class as the series begins. And it's these 2 best friends from this town who everyone knows are going to get kidnapped this year. This beautiful sort of blonde girl named Sophie, who's very much looks exactly like you would expect a Disney princess to look. And her best friend Agatha, who lives in a graveyard and lives by herself and wears black every day and is very much sort of the stereotype of the Disney witch.
But of course, there's a twist.
Sophie, the princess, gets dropped into the School for Evil with all these murders and monsters and kids of famous fairy tale villains. And Agatha gets dropped into the School for Good with all the future princes and princesses. And so this question of why they got switched into the wrong school becomes the seed of this huge epic series that sort of follows everything that happens to them. The thing with the School for Good and Evil is there's no easy answers to who the good guy is and who the bad guy is. I think that is always such a dangerous thing in children's literature, to so easily paint people as either the hero or the villain.
Chainani says his modern fairy tale is more faithful to the themes found in the original Grimm's fairy tales.
Often it's so much about the decisions you make in a given moment. So you might have a character who is very much a trickster or a prankster or just sort of like a bad kid. But if he's smart, he'll survive. It's this question of, can you use your wits to get out of a situation? You constantly see those in the Grimm stories. And it's not so much about like this purity of goodness that you see in Disney. It's much more about just pure intelligence. Red Riding Hood, she really is a brat in that original Grimm story, but the way she gets out of it is quite clever. In the original story, she escapes the wolf by playing a game with him. So I think it's those kind of things that stuck with me. It was about intelligence. It was about plans, scheming your way out of things.
Chainani says he likes to use each book as a platform to look more deeply at a big question he hopes young readers will parse through and consider.
Every book deals with a binary that I'm trying to sort of mess around with. So the first book looks at good and evil. Second book looks at stereotypes of boys and girls. Book 3 is old and young. And the fourth book is truth and lies. And so in this new one, especially given what's just happening in the world in general and the political environment, what those words mean are constantly shifting now. And so being able to play with that in the context of a story, the world in the School for Good and Evil is run by this magical pen that chooses a story to write at any given time. So it is kind of the lord of the land. It chooses who is going to be the next big hero and villain. If you get chosen, it's almost like winning the lottery. You're going to be famous if you can survive your fairy tale. And so the question of, in the fourth book is, do we trust this pen now? Who controls the pen? What if there was another pen? So all these questions of who writes fairy tales and should we trust them starts to come up.
When Chainani tours schools to speak with students, he often poses the following question.
If you had the choice between an amazing hero who was really the coolest hero ever, and they were super ugly, and you had to choose between rooting for them or like the worst villain on earth who was really beautiful, who would you root for? And many, many choose the beautiful villain. And it's just sort of ingrained in our culture because we're brainwashed that way, I think, to believe it. And I think so much of that just comes from what we see. The hero is always good looking and the villain's always ugly. And so that was one of the things that first book in the series really plays with, is this idea of what is beauty a guarantee of goodness and what does beauty actually win you in the end?
Agatha, the atypical princess who lands in the School for Good and who loves to wear black, is not pretty. Even so, Prince Tidoros falls in love with her.
And so with Agatha, you get that real mix of graceful and clumsy and weird and fun and just very much like a girl he's never met. And so she becomes beautiful to him. And I think she becomes beautiful to everybody, just in terms of the fact that she has the self-awareness that no one else does.
Chainani says there's even an online test kids can take to see if they belong in the School for Good or the School for Evil. He says no one person is 100% good or 100% evil, but that we're all a combination of the two. In other words, we all fall into the gray area. You can learn more about our guest Soman Chainani and his book series, The School for Good and Evil, by visiting our website at viewpointsonline.net. This week's show was written and produced by Evan Rook and Polly Hansen. Our executive producer is Reed Pence. Studio production by Jason Dickey. I'm Marty Peterson.
Viewpoints returns in just a moment.
Many seniors are not receiving an important health evaluation during routine checkups with their doctors, according to the Alzheimer's Association 2019 Alzheimer's Disease Facts and Figures report. New data shows that only half of seniors are being assessed for cognitive decline in the primary care setting, and only 1 in 7 are receiving regular assessments. Alzheimer's Association Chief Program Officer Joanne Pike says the report highlights a missed opportunity for seniors and their physicians.
These findings are in sharp contrast to the majority of seniors who receive other routine assessments like cholesterol, diabetes, vision, and hearing. The Alzheimer's Association encourages seniors to be more proactive in discussing memory-related concerns so that changes warranting further attention can be addressed in a timely manner.
Pike says that while there is currently no cure for Alzheimer's, early detection and diagnosis of the disease offers many important benefits. Learn more about the warning signs of Alzheimer's dementia at alz.org.
2 new studies show that only 10% of young women are aware heart disease is the leading cause of death in women. In fact, more than 75% of young women say they're not worried at all about getting heart disease or worry only a little. The surveys show they're much more concerned about other health issues, such as mood disorders. These, along with lack of awareness, are barriers to heart-healthy habits, according to Dr. Marianne Bowman, an American Heart Association science volunteer.
It's important to remember that heart health is a long-term goal. We can help encourage young women to adopt health behaviors, like moving more and eating smart, to improve confidence in the short term, while at the same time setting them up for a healthy future.
The surveys find that most young adult women have taken some actions to preserve their health, but heart health ranks well below concerns such as depression, anxiety, and sexual health. The studies were presented at the American Heart Association's Epidemiology and Prevention Lifestyle Scientific Sessions 2019.
And that's Viewpoints for this week. Viewpoints is a production of Media Tracks Communications. You can follow us on Twitter and Facebook to learn about upcoming shows and find a library of past programs on iTunes. Plus, you'll always find podcasts of our segments and information about our guests at viewpointsonline.net. Join us again next week for your public affairs magazine, Viewpoints.